On June 22, 1941, the world changed forever. At dawn, the German Reich unleashed its greatest gamble, Operation Barbarossa. What followed was not just a war, but an apocalypse on Earth. Cities burned, millions were captured, and entire nations were torn apart. Yet, within this chaos, a darker story emerged. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens turned their backs on their homeland and chose to fight alongside their invaders. Why did they do it? Survival? Hatred of Stalin? Or something even deeper? Today, we uncover one of the most haunting chapters of World War II, June 22, 1941. At dawn, the largest land invasion in human history begins. Over 3 million Axis soldiers surge across the Soviet frontier in a storm of steel and fire. Entire cities are engulfed in flames, skies darken with smoke, and a war of annihilation is unleashed. For the Soviet Union, it is nothing short of an apocalypse. The Red Army, crippled by Stalin's purges, stumbles into chaos. Commanders are inexperienced, communication collapses, and soldiers, many barely trained conscripts, are ordered to resist against impossible odds. But how do you stand firm when your enemy commands the skies, the roads, and the very pace of the war itself? Within weeks, vast Soviet armies are encircled, swallowed whole by the German blitzkrieg. Millions of men are cut off, abandoned, and forced to march into captivity. Entire divisions vanish without a trace, leaving only silence and broken lines. Yet, in this chaos, something darker begins to unfold. Terrorized by their own government and crushed by the unstoppable Wehrmacht, some Soviet soldiers begin to wonder. Do they fight on for a regime that has already betrayed them? Or do they gamble everything on survival, even if it means siding with the enemy? By the summer of 1941, the Soviet catastrophe deepened. Nearly 3.5 million Red Army soldiers had fallen into German hands. For most, capture did not mean safety. It meant a slow death. The Wehrmacht herded prisoners into endless columns, forcing them on brutal death marches that stretched for weeks. Stragglers were shot where they fell. Those who survived the journey arrived at makeshift camps, nothing more than barbed wire and open fields. There were no shelters, no proper rations, and no mercy. Starvation became the camp's cruelest weapon. Prisoners were given crumbs, if anything at all. Corpses piled up so quickly that disease spread faster than bullets. By the start of 1942, the vast majority of these men were already gone, consumed by hunger, cold, and despair. And yet, in this nightmare, survival instinct whispered to the living. Some began to ask themselves the unthinkable. If serving the Germans meant one more day alive, could that be worth betraying the motherland? Others clung to their principles, waiting for death rather than collaboration. For every prisoner behind the wire, the choice loomed heavy: resist and perish, or compromise and survive. It was a decision that would reshape the war on the Eastern Front. Out of the barbed wire camps came a new figure on the Eastern Front, the Hiwi, short for Hilfswillige, or those willing to help. To the Germans, they were expendable tools. To starving Soviet prisoners, they were a chance at survival. At first, the Hiwi were confined to the shadows of war. They cooked meals, repaired trucks, and carried supplies. Hitler himself sneered at the idea of Slavic subhumans fighting alongside the Reich. But as the campaign dragged on and German casualties mounted, desperation began to erode ideology. Gradually, these auxiliaries were handed rifles. They guarded depots, manned trenches, and soon marched into battle itself. By the time of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was crumbling, and within its ranks were more than 50,000 Hiwi, fighting not for the Führer's vision, but simply to survive another day. For the Soviets, their existence was a cruel betrayal. Former comrades now stood across the battlefield, wearing German uniforms and pointing German guns. For the Germans, the Hiwi were both a blessing and a burden, untrusted, indispensable, and always watched with suspicion. Survival had birthed collaboration, and collaboration was about to take on new and far more dangerous forms. As the war dragged deeper into the Soviet heartland, the Germans looked beyond the Slavic prisoners for new allies. Nazi ideology branded Slavs as inferior, but other peoples of the Soviet Union, Armenians, Georgians, Central Asians, Tatars, were seen as useful tools in dismantling Stalin's empire. Thus were born the Eastern Legions. 6 national formations were raised, each carrying the hope, or the illusion, of liberation from Moscow's iron grip. Some saw their service as a path toward independence. Others joined simply to escape the starvation and brutality of the camps. From the Baltic states, where Soviet rule had been freshly imposed, recruits poured into German service. Many believed they were striking back at the communists who had occupied their homelands only months before. They marched under German banners, imagining that one day they might replace the swastika with their own national flags. But in truth, these legions were never trusted. They were commanded by German officers, used for dangerous assignments, and denied any real autonomy. Still, their numbers swelled, and their presence reshaped the Eastern Front. Collaboration was no longer just about survival. It was becoming a weapon of ideology, nationalism, and revenge. Among the most striking collaborators were the Cossacks, fierce horsemen of the steppes, long famed for their warrior traditions. Stalin had crushed them mercilessly in the 1930s, branding them enemies of the state. Now, as the Wehrmacht thundered east, old wounds reopened. To Nazi ideologists, the Cossacks were a peculiar exception. Unlike the Slavs they despised, Cossacks were painted as descendants of some long-lost Aryan past, hardy, martial, and worthy of German trust. This twisted logic made them ideal candidates for collaboration. By 1943, Cossack formations under German command numbered over 25,000 men. They rode in cavalry brigades, patrolled the vast frontier, and clashed with Soviet partisans in forests and villages. Many saw themselves not as traitors, but as warriors reclaiming freedom from Moscow's tyranny. Yet their gamble came at a terrible price. The Germans welcomed their strength, but never their independence. To Berlin, the Cossacks were useful soldiers, nothing more, and when the tide of war turned, their fate would mirror that of all collaborators: betrayal, exile, or death. For a time, however, the Cossack horsemen thundered across the Eastern Front, a reminder that survival, vengeance, and identity could all blur together in the fires of war. Not every collaborator wore the mask of survival. For some, the war against Stalin was an opportunity, an opening to break free from Soviet rule and carve out their own future. Across Ukraine, nationalist groups seized the moment. To them, German tanks rumbling across the steppe were not invaders but liberators, at least at first. Underground movements like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists openly cooperated with the Wehrmacht, dreaming of an independent Ukraine rising from the ruins of Moscow's empire. Some even launched brutal campaigns of ethnic cleansing, slaughtering Polish civilians in hopes of reshaping the demographic map in their favor. In the Baltic states, the story was similar. Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, still scarred by recent Soviet occupation, flocked to German ranks. To these men, the swastika was preferable to the hammer and sickle, if only because it promised revenge. But if they expected freedom, they were mistaken. The Reich never intended to grant them independence. Instead, these nationalists became pawns, deployed in bloody battles and often implicated in atrocities. Their collaboration was not born from starvation, but from ideology, ambition, and the desperate hope that by siding with Hitler, they could destroy Stalin. Collaboration on the Eastern Front reached its darkest chapter in the Holocaust. For the Nazis, Soviet collaborators became a convenient instrument of terror. For those desperate enough to serve, survival came at a horrifying price. From the prison camps, men were plucked and retrained, not as soldiers, but as executioners. These so-called Travniki men, named after their SS training camp, were tasked with guarding ghettos, patrolling barbed wire, and manning the death camps. Armed and uniformed, they enforced the Reich's machinery of extermination. In Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, nationalist auxiliaries went further still. They eagerly aided the Germans in mass shootings, rounding up Jews, and burning villages to the ground. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and in the smoke of gunfire, centuries of coexistence were obliterated in days. For many collaborators, it was the ultimate compromise, choosing life by taking countless others. For the victims, there was no distinction. Whether the uniform bore a swastika or the face of a familiar neighbor, death came all the same. Collaboration here was no longer a gray choice of survival. It was complicity in genocide. The point where the desperate struggle to live became indistinguishable from outright murder. Beyond the battlefronts, another conflict raged in the shadows, a civil war of neighbors, families, and entire villages torn apart. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Soviet rule collapsed in vast swaths of occupied territory. Into this vacuum came two rival forces, Soviet-backed partisans and German-backed militias. Partisans struck from forests and marshes, sabotaging railways, ambushing convoys, and punishing anyone suspected of aiding the occupiers. But their resistance was often brutal. Villagers were coerced into supplying food or forcibly drafted into partisan bands. Refusal could mean death. In response, the Germans armed local self-defense units, men who had lived under Stalin's purges and now saw Moscow as the greater evil. These militias hunted partisans relentlessly, sometimes settling old scores under the guise of justice. Caught between them were ordinary civilians. One day, German troops would seize their grain at gunpoint. The next, partisans would storm in and execute them as collaborators. Entire villages vanished in flames, condemned by one side for resisting, by the other for submission. It was no longer clear who the enemy truly was. For millions across the occupied Soviet Union, survival meant navigating a war where loyalty was demanded by both sides, and betrayal was punished by death. In the chaos of occupation, one region stood out as a chilling experiment in collaboration: the so-called Lokot autonomy. Nestled in western Russia, a cluster of villages banded together under German approval, forming their own government and raising militias to crush the Soviet partisans. At its heart was Bronislaw Kaminsky, a ruthless opportunist who dreamed of building a fascist Russian state under Nazi protection. From Lokot, he commanded the infamous Kaminsky Brigade, thousands strong, notorious for its ferocity. They burned villages, executed suspected sympathizers, and left trails of smoke and corpses across Russia and Belarus. The Germans rewarded their brutality with unprecedented freedom. Lokot was allowed to govern itself, a twisted showcase of what collaboration could look like. To Berlin, Kaminsky was useful, a hammer against the partisans. To the people, he was a tyrant, as feared as Stalin's own enforcers. By 1944, the Kaminsky Brigade marched west with the retreating Wehrmacht, bringing its cruelty into Poland. There, during the Warsaw Uprising, Kaminsky's men committed atrocities so savage that even German commanders recoiled. The Lokot experiment revealed the darkest truth of collaboration: that in the vacuum of war, loyalty and ideology could be twisted into weapons as brutal as the occupiers themselves. By 1944, collaboration on the Eastern Front reached its final chapter. Out of desperation, and against Hitler's own prejudices, the Germans allowed a true Russian army to form. At its head stood a defector, General Andrei Vlasov, once a rising star of the Red Army, now the leader of the Russian Liberation Army, or ROA, Numbering up to 50,000 men, the ROA was meant to rally Soviet defectors under one banner. But by then, the war was already lost. For many of its soldiers, the real goal was not victory for the Reich, it was escape. They dreamed of fleeing west, away from Stalin's wrath, into the hands of the Americans. In May 1945, one ROA division even turned its guns on the Germans, aiding Czech resistance fighters during the Prague Uprising. For a fleeting moment, collaborators became liberators. But it was too late. When the guns finally fell silent, their fate was sealed. Captured by the Allies, thousands were handed back to the Soviets. For Stalin, there was no forgiveness. Execution, gulags, or exile awaited nearly all. The story of Soviet collaboration ended in betrayal and tragedy. A reminder that in the brutal crucible of the Eastern Front, survival often came at the cost of honor, and sometimes of humanity itself. The story of Soviet collaboration is not one of heroes or villains, but of human beings trapped in an impossible choice. For some, it was survival. For others, revenge or blind hope. And for many, it ended in betrayal, tragedy, and death. As the guns of war fell silent in 1945, those who had once fought alongside the Reich found themselves condemned by history, forever branded as traitors. Yet their tale reminds us of the terrible weight of war, where morality blurs and survival can demand the unthinkable. In the end, there were no victors, only survivors and shadows.